We are very pleased today to welcome Sharon Megdal. So she's director of the Water Research Center at the University of Arizona. So she will talk about the wicked water problems and bridging through water. So before the lecture of Sharon, I just would like to introducing two of the three co-coordinators of H2O'Lyon Graduate School who are present today. So we have Sylvie Barrault. Yes, welcome, Sylvie. So she is professor and the director of the Civil Engineering and Urbanism department at the engineering school in South Lyon, and Hervé Pieguet, who is research director at the CNRS at the Environment, City and Society Laboratory. So just in few minutes, if Sylvie, you can just shortly present the H2O'Lyon to the attendees. So we are listening to you.
Yes, just a few words about H2O'Lyon. So H2O'Lyon was launched quite recently. It is a graduate school aiming at, let's say, aiming at deploying or promoting interdisciplinary work and approaches in the field of water management, both in different contexts, both in natural or anthropic context. So basically, the idea is to use education and research developed in the research community from Lyon, which you may know is very active in the domain of water. We have many observatory, on-field observatory, many local networks, and many international activities. In particular, we organized every three years a conference, Novatech, on urban storm drainage, and East River on a large river. So the idea is to train people able to meet the major environmental and socioeconomic challenges linked to water problems. And our ambition is, let's say, on the one hand, to gather and to be involved in a worldwide research and education efforts to better understand ecosystems and propose best water management practices and visions. And in the other end, our ambition is also to integrate practitioners and their problem stakeholders in this sort of think tank and education program to try to co-construct these new visions and new knowledges and practices. So in this context, we have many actions, and one of our actions was to launch a series of online mini conferences from researchers or from practitioners from all over the world. And Sharon from the University of Arizona is one of these presenters, and even the very first one of the series. So I would like to thank her for that. And I won't be longer, and maybe I will give the floor to David Blanchon for a short introduction of Sharon and maybe Sharon's work. So David, maybe.
Okay. Okay, is it okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
I would suggest that Crystal stop sharing her screen so we could see you bigger, David.
That's it? That's it?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so good morning, Sharon. It's 8 a.m. in Tucson, Arizona, and good evening for everybody of France. I will make only a very short presentation in English first, then in French, as Sharon keeps her CV up to date on the WRRC website, and you can find everything, you can read everything if you want to know more about works, achievement. It's a 47-page CV online, so I think it's very, very complete and up to date. I just want to stress that Sharon have done quite a lot of work on groundwater governance and management here in Arizona, but also quite a bit in Israel, Jordan, Middle East region. And also, she has been to France many times for projects as a UNESCO International Hydrological Program, for the OECD. Also, she has been giving some lecture at the CNRS, at Haute-Paris, also at the 2012 World Water Forum in Marseille. And my last point, because it's a very short presentation, it's in English. I was stress that Sharon is also deeply involved in water management policy, and she has served in numerous boards and commission, for instance, American Water Resource Association, Central Arizona Project, and a lot of board and commission. Also, she's deeply involved in policy here, also in Tucson and in Southern Arizona. You can find all the detail online, so I will switch to French. And it's easier for me. Disons qu'il est difficile de résumer en moins de 5 minutes tous les travaux et les multiples engagements de Sharon Megdal, donc qui est directrice du Water Resource Center de l'Université d'Arizona. Pour une fois, je vais commencer le CV par la fin en disant que donc Sharon est depuis 2014, il me semble, directrice de ce centre qui est un des meilleurs du monde dans les classifications, mais même plus généralement pour la question de gestion de l'eau, notamment dans les zones arides et semi-arides. Il couvre vraiment un terrain extrêmement large qui va de, vous avez parlé de stormwater management, il y a aussi des gens qui au Water Resource Center s'occupent de water management, jusqu'à la gestion agricole, jusqu'à la géohydrologie, et puis avec Sharon, jusqu'à la gestion de l'eau urbaine ou la gestion des eaux transfrontalières, des aquifères transfrontaliers. Donc, c'est vraiment un très grand centre de recherche et je vous invite évidemment à aller voir sur le site web. Il y a un petit magazine qui s'appelle Arroyo, qui est très bien fait, qui veut dire petit cours d'eau en espagnol et qui est très bien fait, où vous trouverez beaucoup de documentation sur l'Ouest américain, mais même plus largement sur la gestion de l'eau. Je dirais que Sharon est un peu à l'image du centre qu'elle dirige, ayant une vision globale du cycle de l'eau à partir de sa formation originelle qui était en économie, de PhD et master en économie, à la fois ancré localement sur la région de Tucson, mais aussi avec des comparaisons internationales. Donc j'ai parlé effectivement de Israël, Jordanie, mais on pourrait parler aussi du Mexique. Et en même temps, c'est le dernier point que je voulais faire dans cette vraiment courte présentation, c'est qu'elle a une approche évidemment scientifique, comme on éloigne toutes ces publications, ces très très nombreuses publications sur la question de l'eau, mais aussi une inscription dans la pratique de la gestion de l'eau. Et comme je disais en anglais, elle est membre de nombreux boards d'institutions de recherche d'institutions de gestion de l'eau, locaux, mais aussi nationaux. Et aussi, elle est très active dans un des points qui est vraiment de discussion ici, c'est la gestion de l'eau du Colorado, avec notamment au travers le Central Arizona Project, et encore aussi des boards internationaux là-dessus. Vous trouverez tous les détails sur la page web. Enfin, donc Sharon était venue en France pour des projets liés à l'UNESCO, à l'OCDE, des conférences. Et je pense qu'elle se réjouissait de revenir en France quand on avait pensé avec l'UMI iGlobe, qui était un peu la cheville ouvrière, qui est une branche du CNRS ici à Tucson, de monter ce voyage en France. Il y avait aussi des conférences prévues à l'ENS Paris. Et mais nous espérons bien l'accueillir l'an prochain. Sharon, we hope to welcome you next year in France, physically this time. Okay, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And it is my pleasure to be here to be with you virtually today. And I am excited that I'm your first mini conference in this new school. And I want to congratulate you for forming this school, because that is the type of activity that is very, very much needed. I'll say more about some things like what's going on with COVID-19 here and our region as I show my presentation. So I'm going to share the screen. It's now, I have a clock in front of me. It's 8:17. I will do my best to keep it to close to the hour on which I'll stop the presentation, in case some of you have other places to go, but I might go a little over that because I was figuring on a little bit more than 40 minutes for my presentation. So give me a moment. I'm going to put the PowerPoint up. Let's see. Okay, and then somebody just let me know when you're seeing my screen.
Yes, it's okay. For me, everybody.
It's okay.
Okay.
Excellent, excellent.
Excellent,
So,
yes.
all right, so as David and you've all seen, this is the title of my presentation. The photo in the background I'll show a little bit later is of an old bridge going over the lower Jordan River. And throughout the presentation, I may give websites, my email address, as I've indicated to Crystal. They have my access to my presentation. I'm happy to have it circulated or posted in PDF format. It's a bit large to share as a PowerPoint. I am director of the Water Resources Research Center. We are a research and extension unit within the University of Arizona Division of Ag, Life Sciences, and Extension. And we have our own little building, slightly off campus. And it's an old building in Tucson that used to be the Boy Scouts building. And the Boy Scouts motto is be prepared. And I like to show this photo because it's very important to be prepared when it comes to water management. And as you could see, our mission is tackling water policy and management issues, empowering informed decision-making, and enriching understanding through engagement, education, and applied research. The research we engage in tends to be very applied, transdisciplinary type research. Now, here's a little outline of my talk. I want to explain a little bit about why this topic, give you some context that I like to give in almost all of my presentations, provided I have time. Talk about what we mean by wicked water problems, then explore some, talk about developing pathways to solutions as we go along, and talk about the bridging through water. But later in the presentation, I'm going to ask for you to think about wicked water problems of your region, so that during the discussion we can maybe talk about what you see as either in France, your more local region, or in the EU more generally, what you see as wicked water problems. So just a little bit about why I'm here before you today. We had hoped it would be in person, but obviously COVID-19 intervened and got in the way of that. But I've been using the terminology that I was supposed to be on sabbatical this semester. I was on sabbatical for part of it. And my sabbatical activity was a lecture tour, or my primary sabbatical. Zoe, I think, or somebody needs to mute. Part of it was going to be a lecture tour. And the reason I decided to undertake that rather than, let's say, a more traditional research project is that I have found over the years a lot of interest around the United States, around the world, on some of the water management issues we deal with in our region, particularly the Colorado River Basin. The Colorado River is an iconic river. People are also interested in border work with Mexico and how we go about that. I do connect my work here with the water situation in the Middle East, as David mentioned in the introduction, Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories in particular. And so I can't honor all the requests I get for lectures or the places I'd like to go during a regular semester. So I thought this would be a good idea. And it seemed like a good idea. And I offered 6 topics. And one of them, as you can see down on the bottom, it's small, I know that, was wicked water problems and bridging through water. And I was delighted to get some invitations. And I was actually able to visit 2 international spots before COVID hit, or as COVID was hitting, I should say. I was in Singapore for the first time in January and hosted there by National University of Singapore School of Public Policy and had a great visit there. And as I said, I was there just as COVID-19 was really taking hold. It was the Chinese New Year, the Lunar New Year, when I was leaving Singapore. And Singapore, just the day before, had recorded cases 2 and 3 of COVID-19. Some visitors from Wuhan had brought it over. And then shortly thereafter, there was a large outbreak there. And during the month of February, I was in Tucson and debated whether or not I should make the trip I had planned to Israel for the early part of March. And in fact, I did go, but instead of being there for almost 2 weeks, I was there for 3.5 days because the writing was on the wall. And I do write reflections pieces periodically, and here's a website where you can access those. So I came back on March 8th, and then pretty much things shut down here and everywhere else in the middle of March. And interestingly, because somebody asked me before the session started, interestingly, Arizona was not a hot spot in the early days, in part because we had, I believe, this is just my belief, we had the lowest per capita testing in the nation of any state. So we didn't seem to be doing too badly. We reopened in mid-May, or the first or second week of May. And since that time, cases are on the uptick. And like some other places, we're now considered one of the hot spots. So most of us continue to work from home, go into the office only when necessary. Our university is still, for the most part, closed, but working on reopening the research laboratories and also hoping for students to come back in late August when the semester starts. So into now the more substantive part of my talk, I mentioned I'd like to give some context and just background. And as a person, as David mentioned, my training is in economics, but actually my water training comes more from on-the-job training. I headed a regional water district back in the early 1990s. I was a utility regulator for a short time before that. And most of what I've learned about water has not been through the classroom or textbook, but actually through real world experience and interactions. And so my work is very applied, institutionally oriented, and I teach each spring, although not this past spring because I was on sabbatical, a graduate course in water policy, and it's cross-listed in 5 different departments or colleges because it's really an interdisciplinary course or non-disciplinary course that mixes lectures, guest lectures by practitioners, and the students have to write a policy paper, make a presentation, and the like. And so this is a slide I use in the very first meeting of the class and use it in many of my presentations, is just to remind people that what we see on the ground in terms of water management and policy is reflective of many different things. And 2 of them I underline because they're very, very important. And those are the legal framework and also the extent to which water management policy and regulations are made in a centralized versus decentralized way. And it's very interesting when I think of comparing the United States with the EU. We are 50 states in the District of Columbia with about 335 million people. Last I checked, and it's been a little while, you're over 25 countries, and the last I checked, population was about 525 million people. I didn't check recently. But your approach to water management, in my view, is more cohesive and coordinated through the water directive framework than we are in the United States, except for water quality regulations, which actually some recent rulemaking has changed some of that to make it a bit less centralized than it had been. And the importance of context is something I point out And I particularly like to point out the water cycle context, which of course you're all familiar with. This happens to be a brand new graphic that one of my staff put together for a report she just wrote. And it's better than the one I had been using, so I put it in here. And one of the reasons I like to show this graphic in different contexts is because in Arizona and in various parts of the world, there's quite a bit of reliance on groundwater. And sometimes people think of groundwater as this pristine underground lake, just this body of water that's like a river or lake that's all blue, and instead it's really water interspersed with materials. And here's where I like to point out that no new water is created. It may change quality, location, form, and the like. And then the other very important context, besides legal context, that I like to point out is the geographic context. So this is especially important that I do in international audiences, just to talk a little bit about the geographic reach of the Colorado River watershed, which is the area in the dark outline here in the map to your left. It spans 7 states in the United States and extends into Mexico. And there is a treaty governing the sharing of the water between the United States and Mexico. And we have, it's a highly managed river. Water from it is used to support, in one way or another, an estimated 40 million people. And water from the basin is transported outside the basin, such as to Los Angeles and Southern California, Denver, Salt Lake City, Albuquerque, as well as serving users in the basin. It has 2 very large storage reservoirs. And if I were with you in the room, I would ask you how many of you have been to Hoover Dam. Usually with a well-traveled group internationally, many hands will go up. And this is a photo of Hoover Dam, built in the 1930s. And Lake Mead is behind it, which is a very large storage reservoir that has suffered because of the poor hydrology and also use conditions for the Colorado River watershed. And then here's the map just showing Arizona, where I live in Tucson, which is kind of down in the south central part of the state. And we are in Tucson, 65 kilometers from the border with Mexico, and share not only surface water resources, but groundwater resources with Mexico. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I go along. Also want to show you these maps very briefly to point out that we share borders with tribal nations as well, and they have sovereign powers, authorities in many ways, including when it comes to water. And this is a map of the Colorado River Basin that focuses on the tribes, some of which, such as the Navajo Nation in northeastern Arizona, may span 3 different states. And this is a map of Arizona where these golden colors show the boundaries of the many tribal nations in Arizona. There are 22 of them, 21 of which have actual land areas. And I'll mention a couple of them as we go along. And then I just want to show you this Middle East map of the region I tend to focus on, Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories, the West Bank area, and the Gaza. And I'll come back to showing a little sliver of this map and talk about the region there again as I talk about the wicked water problems. And then here's a map of the European Union. I put the list of countries for my benefit, not necessarily yours. This list no longer includes the UK. And I'll come back to this map a little later when I solicit some of your ideas about the wicked water problems. And then one other context slide I'll put up there, but I'm not going to go through, is what I call my issues, challenges, and solutions slide. And this is just a list of the many things that many of us, most of us in this virtual room, are working on in one way or another. And all the things that require attention and are challenging to to address so to manage water well. All right, so getting to the point of wicked water problems, I'm taking some of this from a presentation and a column. A woman, Lisa Buetler from California, shared with us back in 2016. The Water Resources Research Center runs an annual conference. This year, we just held it June 18th and 19th in a virtual format for the first time. She was a keynote speaker and introduced many of us at that conference to this concept of wicked water problems. And because there was a lot of positive feedback about her presentation, we then asked her to write a column for our newsletter, which at the time came out quarterly. We've discontinued that newsletter and do something different now about what to do about wicked water problems. And I'm just going to highlight some of the things that she said in that column. Lately, more and more problems seemingly defy standard solutions. There's not a quick fix. And so what we have to do is develop pathways to the solutions and work on them over a period of time. And these are the four reasons she offered, and I put in the geopolitics here in parentheses, and incomplete or contradictory knowledge, the number of people and opinions involved, large economic burden, and the interconnected nature of these problems with other problems, which certainly is an issue in the Middle East. And these are some other things she said. They're often tossed back and forth among policymakers and decried as too substantial for grand solutions. They're not solved per se, they're only mitigated. Interdisciplinary collaboration, and I was glad to hear your new school is focusing on multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary work that captures a broader knowledge of all these things and more. And it's a new kind of work. It requires changing the questions, managing uncertainty, and creating resilience. And so here are some of the wicked water problems I'm going to touch on in this lecture. And first, I'll talk about some from my region, and then I'll talk about some from the Middle East. The imbalance of water demand and supply in the Colorado River Basin, groundwater overdraft, and the invisibility of groundwater. I've worked on that quite a bit over the years with the International Hydrologic Program at UNESCO. Lack of attention to water for nature and environmental flows. And then lack of availability of clean, reliable water and water infrastructure. And then in the Middle East, some of the examples I'm going to touch on are lower Jordan River flows, the Dead Sea condition, wastewater treatment in some areas, water provision and sources for the West Bank and Gaza, and then water supplies in Jordan. And as you can see, I have a lot of photos in my presentation, and I'm having to go through them without much explanation of where they are and what they're of. But I put them in there to give you an idea of some of the terrain we're dealing with here. And again, my presentation will be available. Many of the photos have captions, so you can look back at that. So on this concept of searching for pathways to solutions, process is very important. And I want to mention a couple of them here. Developing information collaboratively and developing partnerships. And those partnerships can be within states and regions. They can be interstate, international, with tribal nations. And I'm going to come back to these photos in some future slides. But note here is a group of people in a photo from January 31st, 2019, that were celebrating, the group was celebrating the approval and signing by the governor right there and then of legislation relating to drought contingency planning in the Colorado River Basin. And here are some of the options that are fairly universal options when you talk to people anywhere in any country where they're trying to address water challenges, even where they might be water-rich areas. Of course, some of these examples will really be focusing more on the water quantity side rather than the water quality. You in France may deal much more with the water quality side, but droughts happen everywhere. Floods happen everywhere. And so many of these challenges pertain, if not on a chronic, constant basis, maybe on a more acute basis. And so these options that are considered are desalination, reuse, conservation, water banking, voluntary market type transactions, things that you might be able to do at the more individual level through rainwater harvesting. And then something that's, in my opinion, getting only attention only more recently is new ways of designing the built environment. So I'll just ask you to keep in mind these 4 reasons as I go through the following examples of wicked water problems to think about what are the contributing factors to these being challenging to address. So the first one I want to talk about is Colorado River Basin poor hydrology for about 20 years. So since about 2000, with the exception of a few years, precipitation has been below normal. And even in certain years when it might be normal or above normal, temperatures affect the evaporation of the snow and the snowpack, which affects the upper basin flows. And here I'm looking at this middle map here, which is a different map of the Colorado River Basin. But the flows, the headwaters are up here in the north, where it's colder, there's snow, they melt, they travel down, and there are multiple reservoirs along the way. And then they get to the more, the hotter, drier parts of the basin. And so there's a careful watch on what's happening here in terms of snow and precipitation, and then also the runoff. And not only have we been below average for almost all of the 20 past years, there's also an over allocation on the river. And this is where the institutional legal structure comes into play, where the water was allocated based on what people thought the flows would be, based on a historically wet period. And the tree ring studies, which have been done at the University of Arizona, a leader in dendrochronology, show that even in the best of circumstances, average flows will not be enough to support the allocations to the lower basin states in particular. Moreover, climate change is resulting in increasing temperatures for the region and changing precipitation patterns, if not an absolute decrease in precipitation, certainly a change in precipitation patterns. So despite the fact that we were in this situation for, have been in this situation for 20 years, because we've had a couple of good years in there and we've had significant storage behind Hoover Dam and another dam, a shortage had never been declared pursuant to 2017 interim shortage sharing guidelines. And because though the situation was continuing to not look good and maybe even deteriorate, there was a recognized need that we can't count on there not being a shortage. We can't count on prayers for rain to materialize. And so there was a need to look at some additional drought planning by the region. And this is where Arizona is the only state that requires its negotiator to get legislation to sign on to some new regulations. And this is extremely important to Arizona because the Central Arizona Project, which I'll say more about in just a few minutes, is critical to delivering water into Central Arizona, Phoenix, which is home to the Phoenix metropolitan area to over 4 million people, to Tucson, which has the metropolitan area about 1 million people, and many users in between. The whole project is of lower priority to California due to some political bargaining that had to occur back in the 60s. And the agriculture in central Arizona is even of lower priority. So we undertook in the basin this drought contingency planning. And here are just some of the players. And I mentioned Mexico and I outlined them in red because I don't have the time today to talk a lot about Colorado River Basin collaboration with Mexico. But Mexico was involved in its own interpretation of the treaty related to shortage sharing, the 7 states that I mentioned earlier, and within each state or across the states, you had the various users, municipal, tribal, industrial, agricultural. You had NGOs, particularly environmental NGOs, non-governmental organizations, playing a substantial role. The development community, home builders and land developers all were involved. And here are some of the key players. I'm not going to go through the litany of them, but overlap in some cases with what I already mentioned. And there was, this was a signing ceremony at Hoover Dam a year ago, May, when we came to agreement on this overlay. Here's that photo again of the people in Arizona celebrating the signing of its agreement and coming to terms among the parties. We've had very participatory processes. Here's a big room where meetings were held involving the many participants in the process. And many, many agreements. There was so much behind this and so much complexity at the interstate level. Federal legislation was required. Fortunately, it was one of the few things I can think of that happened really quickly at the federal level because the homework had really been done by all the participating states and entities. And I had the privilege of being at that signing ceremony at Hoover Dam with some of my colleagues from the Central Arizona Project. So this mitigates, but doesn't solve the problem of the long-term imbalance of Colorado River supply and demand, the wicked problem that the drought contingency plans were approved in 2019, but the work has already begun on the next step. These guidelines are only through 2026, which is around the corner. And so there's work already, as I mentioned, underway to develop the next step. Let me go on to the second example I wanted to touch on for our region, and that is kind of bringing it closer to home to the issues in Central Arizona and Central Arizona agriculture and groundwater. And so this is a map showing the Central Arizona project within the state of Arizona. I'm going to show you some photos of the project itself in a moment, but it's a lengthy canal. I don't know if I no, I think I left out the slide in which I had the metric. It's 336 miles. I think I had that as over 500 kilometers in length. It goes uphill. And it's built to deliver about 1,875 million cubic meters of water annually. And this low priority was at issue. In particular, between Phoenix and Tucson is this yellowed area, and even some areas within the Phoenix area and the Tucson area that are highly agricultural, and they are of low priority. And with the drought contingency plan, even though we haven't gotten into a deep shortage, 2020 is the first year that there is a cutback in deliveries of water through the Central Arizona project that is impacting Central Arizona farmers and is expected to impact Central Arizona farmers for at least the next few years. And so they're returning back to groundwater. The Central Arizona project and the delivery of surface water, which really just took hold from the mid-80s and on. It wasn't completed to the Tucson area until the early 1990s. Until the late 80s, early 90s, this area here had been totally dependent on groundwater, as had Tucson. And this new surface water supply allowed for surface water to be used in place of groundwater. But now, because of the drought and the cutbacks, these farmers in particular have the right, this gets back to the importance of the legal framework, the right to go back on the groundwater pump. That groundwater that they use is fossil groundwater. It's been drawn down to low levels below land surface. There's still quite a lot underground, but there's not infinite quantity, and some of it is very low in reach, meaning expensive to pump. So there are some real issues in what will supply the water for this very productive agriculture, very important to the economy and to potentially meeting food needs, and is meeting food needs right now. And also, this is an area that's growing because the Phoenix area remains one of the fastest growing areas in the United States. So how do you meet the water needs of that region in a reliable and sound way so that people could be assured, and we have rules for this, we have assured water supply rules, that the water is physically there for the future? And there have been, this is an example where maybe we could speak to that incomplete or disagreed upon information. There's a lot of disagreement on the modeling that's been done by our Arizona Department of Water Resources, and potentially also the large economic burden that could be involved in addressing this. I happen to sit on a stakeholder group that's working on looking at these issues. And here, this is an aerial photo of part of the Central Arizona project. It's a lined open canal, meaning not covered. The water is pumped uphill through a series of pump stations. The width of the canal is shown by the thickness of this blue line. And here's a photo of one of the pumping stations. And then I just put this in there. I used this slide in a recent presentation to just show you a little bit about some of the terrain. This is a tribal community, the Gila River Indian community between Phoenix and Tucson. We, a year ago, had a conference looking at desert waters and had some visitors from Australia visiting us. And this is some recharge that they've started doing using some of the water that they obtained through a water rights settlement that was many, many years in the making. So very complex situation, dry environment where it can come back to life rather quickly if there's water. And then I mentioned the issue of water for nature. And here I put up some images from a presentation I made back in 2014 at an international conference focusing on the lower Jordan River in Israel. And I was invited to be a keynote speaker to talk about the Colorado River Basin. And I talked about work I had done looking at the shared borders and shared waters and comparing Israel-Palestine with US-Mexico, and talked a bit about this pulse flow, which I don't have the time to get into, but I'll say this. The water that goes to Mexico from the Colorado River, instead of going down to the delta or the normal natural end of the river, it gets diverted and shifted west for use. And so the delta, which is an area of great environmental and natural interest, has been very dried. And so in 2014, there was a pulse flow effort involving the federal governments of both countries, NGOs, and others to let some water flow south instead of be diverted to the west. And it was a great example of what happens when water gets introduced to areas that haven't had it for a while, what it means to nature and what it also means to people. And there's a beautiful 10-minute little film on this that's narrated by the famous United States actor Robert Redford. And I have the link there. And I showed the first 5 minutes of the video as part of my presentation. And I want to tell you that I've had people in Israel as recently as a year or two ago come up to me and say, Oh, I remember the talk you gave. That was such a great talk. Well, I've got to tell you, the reason they remember it is not because I gave such a wonderful talk. The reason they remember it is because I stopped the video at this point, showing this little girl overjoyed playing in the water in a riverbed that is usually dry. And that's why people remember it, because they remember seeing the implication of the water for a young girl. So that one, again, it's a big problem of many dimensions. Can't get into it here, but people are working on it. There has been work by the US and Mexico that continues. It's connected with the drought contingency plans. It's part of the whole big Colorado River system and all the challenges associated with it. Now, the last one from my region that I wanted to mention was COVID-19 incidents, the Navajo Nation, and water accessibility. And this has gotten national and I believe international news. I believe BBC and some of the British outlets have picked up and covered it. I don't know if any of your outlets in France have, but the Navajo Nation, which, as I mentioned earlier, spans 3 states, it is a large land area, a very rural population, and 30% or more of the people on the nation do not have water delivered to their homes. They don't have running water in their homes. And this is a chronic problem. It's been known. Part of the issues of dealing with it are tied up in issues of water rights settlements, as well as funding for the infrastructure necessary. But in the situation of COVID-19, the need to wash your hands all the time and to self-isolate are very difficult. When you don't have running water or you don't have clean water of the quality you want to disinfect things, it's very hard to meet the requirements to wash your hands all the time. Housing, in many cases, is lacking or sufficient housing, such that you have many homes with multi-generational residents. And so can you isolate the more elderly from the younger? And the people who have to get water, who don't have it coming to their homes, they have to often travel very long distances to get that water to haul back. And sometimes, depending on where they get it, the quality may be not as good as if they get it through a more official source. But also they have to stop and eat, use restroom facilities, get gasoline. And so it's been very, very difficult. And so the COVID-19 situation has brought national and international attention to the situation there with water infrastructure. And we're hoping those of us who have been aware of this for a long time, and those who work on it more closely than I do, that this attention will not be short-lived and there will be some strides made. The Navajo Nation had the highest per capita incidence in the United States when compared to any state in the nation, which is one of the reasons why it's gotten the attention. All right, so very quickly moving to some of the lower Jordan River and Dead Sea conditions. Here's where some of the correspondences with my region and the Colorado River Basin will come into play. But here you have a situation where you've got a growing area, you've got scarcity of natural water. Yes, Israel's a leader in desalinated water or manufactured water, but you've got climate change implications where the inflows into the Sea of Galilee, which is an important reservoir for Israel and also for Israel's treaty obligations and agreements with Jordan, is at very, very low levels. That has implications for the quality and salinity. The discharges from the Sea of Galilee go into the lower Jordan River, pictured here in this upper right photo. That is the only natural inflow into the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea is receding. This is a photo from the Israel side. This is a photo I took from the Jordan side. And this photo here shows water being taken from the Dead Sea and delivered south of there for potash processing through evaporation ponds. And I'm not going to take the time to go back, but the Dead Sea used to be years ago a large body that's now divided into two sections. The north section, pictured here and here, which is the more natural but receding part of it, and then the lower part, which is really water that's diverted from the upper part for potash manufacturing. And what to do about the Dead Sea, what to do about the quantity and quality of water flowing to the Jordan Sea is challenging in the best of circumstances, but also made even more challenging by the geopolitics of the area. And another example of geopolitical issues is here showing a map of the areas of the West Bank. And the blue does not signify water. The blue signifies a different area designation on the map. And this region is divided into areas A, B, and C. And that all has to do with who has security abilities, authorities for providing water. The darker tan color is the area A, which is under the authority of the Palestinian Authority. And what you see is it's not all contiguous. It's like almost like Swiss cheese. I'm not sure that's the best analogy to make, but it's what comes to mind as when I first saw this map a few years ago. And so when you think about water provision and you don't have contiguous areas to build your infrastructure and serve, it makes it even more difficult. And if you think about the two-state solution and formation of a Palestinian state, and if there's going to be, water independence and autonomy, this is even more important. And then wastewater treatment, I mentioned, and of course, the water quality and treatment of wastewater is and are issues across the globe, and Sustainable Development Goals focus on that. And this is an area where this is the West Bank here with the wall. This is a very primitive aeration facility on the Israel side, and you have waste coming across the border, being treated at a substandard, let's say old plant to secondary standards. Some of it's not treated at all. Some of the treatment on the Israel side is to secondary standards, and the pollution flows into a stream. And this is an example of where it's not technology, it's not even economics that stand in the way, but it's the ability to address and get things done in this transborder setting. And so I was very affected when I first saw this area back in 2011, because the pollution issues, in my humble opinion, should not be. So I give it as an example of the wicked water problem. And here's some, I'll just cover briefly some, I'm on slide 31. I number my slides. By the way, for you professors out there or students, I always advise my students to number their slides, and anybody too, because it enables you to keep track when you might not be able to follow notes or clock that carefully. So I'm going to pace myself going forward. But a water supply in Jordan is clearly a problem, depending upon the metric used. Jordan is cited as the second most water stressed nation in the world, maybe third or fourth most. And they are treating some of their wastewater, distributing that to a stream, mixing it with some surface water to deliver for agricultural use. When I showed these slides, and I showed corresponding slides at a lecture last April at the Hashemite University in Jordan, and Prince Al Hassan bin Talal, who's pictured here, part of the royal family, the uncle of the king and the brother of the former, now deceased king, said, wow, look at that water. It doesn't look very good and very clean. And so even though they have a pretty good treatment plan, I've seen it, there's still water quality issues, and there are also water quantity issues, severe water quantity issues, such that something like gray water could be used to take water from homes, brown water, not black water, gray water rather, not brown or black water. And instead of it going into cesspools, have it go through a filtration system and pumped up, subject to ultraviolet light, and then used to supplant the water. But this is very small scale. How do you deal with these issues? Large scale for a region that doesn't bound the Mediterranean Sea as do some of the other Arab states and Israel. So some of the key factors that I would point out that can contribute to mitigating wicked water problems are listed here. Functioning cooperative mechanisms, whether it's cooperation within a region or across regions or across countries, are essential, and they don't always exist. And that was part of the dialogue that occurred back in 2016 when the commissioners, the then sitting commissioners of the International Boundary and Water Commission, visited the region and met with some high-level officials there. Trust and mutual respect, often lacking, maybe not in some situations, but sometimes there's a lot of skepticism among parties, even if they're outwardly respectful. And so that's very important. The involvement of the key stakeholders, extremely important, and something that has been expanded in the Colorado River Basin significantly in the last decade or 15 years. A good communication, where as we're doing right here, we're sometimes communicating across languages, and we have to make sure we have effective communication mechanisms. We also need to be respectful of cultures and different cultural differences and the like. Persistence and patience, which are not necessarily the same thing, are both often needed. And the ability to share experiences and lessons learned, both positive and negative. And this photo on the bottom, each spring when I teach my class, we go on a field trip to some of the water features in our region. And this photo is taken with a number of representatives from the state of Sonora, Mexico, who wanted to see more of what Arizona is doing. And once I heard about that, I said, oh, come join my class field trip, and it was great. So collaborating around transboundary on transboundary aquifers. I'm not going to go into this. We have a whole website or web page on our website about the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program. We're very proud of this because through the auspices of a cooperative framework that was developed between the United States and Mexico, we've produced the first ever binational, bilingual, every map is bilingual report on an important binational aquifer, and there's work going on others. And one of my PhD students is in the final stages of writing one of her chapters, her final chapter, on how this cooperative framework could be a model for others who are looking to do studies across borders. And then I want to mention just some recent experience. This was in November of 2019. I organized a panel at an international conference in Tel Aviv, at which people from Mexico, the United States, and Israel shared information and experiences on a panel about implementing technology across borders. And this is the example of where getting together is really helpful, and I'll say a little bit more about that. The Israelis talked about the Red Sea, Dead Sea project, which I'll say is an example of a project that was devised to address some of those wicked water problems of the region that I talked about earlier in terms of water supply for Jordan, water supply for the south of Israel and for the Palestinian territories. However, it's been stalled, its implementation has been stalled due to some of the geopolitical and other factors, including the fact that in Israel they had a year without a government that could do budgeting. But the question I asked them at the end of this interactive discussion was, what are the most important variables or factors that can contribute to implementing technologies across borders? And I put up this as, well, I prepared this. I didn't actually put it up as, at that time I was getting into kind of putting words along with the letters of important words. So this was some items that would go with the English spelling of the word respect, and you can read what I put up there. But more important, and here I've got that bridge again because it shows that we're bridging through these issues through water, that we're trying to get to resolution, to some solutions, maybe despite some of the geopolitical issues that are going on. You know, we have some issues between the US and Mexico, yet the water work continues, although I have to say it's slowed down by COVID-19 some. But here were some of the takeaways that came from my panel. And the first thing they said was eat with your partners, the importance of having those relationships where you can sit down, you can eat, you can get to know your partners and develop the relationships necessary to work through some of these things. And then, you know, identifying what is beneficial to both nations or parties. It doesn't have to be different nations in order to identify win-win opportunities. But they noted that that can be difficult. The relationships can have peaks and can have lows. They pointed out, especially when working with neighbors with different cultures, languages, a good communication, sincerity, and leadership will enable things to happen. And again, they came back to noting the importance of fostering the friendships even that can then facilitate the work required to forge the formal agreements. And so I'm down to my last couple slides here. And so while I make my final remarks, I ask for you to maybe put in the chat, or maybe when I wrote the slide, I wasn't exactly sure how Christelle was going to handle the Q&A. So it might be that you can say the verbally, but think about your suggestions of wicked water problems in the EU. And when you're making those suggestions, you'll probably see me taking some notes here. But as concluding remarks, I want to refer back to Lisa Buettler and her comment that wicked water problems involves a new kind of work, and it requires changing the questions, managing uncertainty to the extent you can, of course, hard to do, and creating resilience. And I want to note, and I've said some of this, technology is important, of course, economics is important, but the process of working with and through stakeholders and bridging is key to making progress. And continuing educational efforts at all levels is very, very important. And again, congratulations to you for forming the new school. But the question is, when will we be able to meet and eat with our partners? How will we bridge, and can we be successful bridging when we don't have those interactions? And so the photos below, this is from our annual conference in 2019 in February. You can see a packed room. I was actually on the dais at that time. I took that photo. This is a photo from last November where part of our delegation had just an absolutely wonderful meal. This was a year ago, April, my last trip to Jordan, visiting. This is a key collaborator on that gray water system that I showed you earlier. And I was invited into his home to have dinner and meet his wonderful family. And these things are, these in-person meetings are very, very important, because I will give you a couple of examples of some things that emerged out of our being, my being at conferences in person. And that is in November, when we were in Israel in the exhibit hall, some of the Arizona and, well, Colorado River Basin, they weren't all from Arizona, Colorado River Basin and Mexican delegates met with some people who have developed a new kind of drip irrigation. And because they met with them, had a chance to talk with them, there's actually a pilot project going on right now in Arizona with a tribal nation. I'm not sure that would have happened if they hadn't been there in person to meet and to speak and to make the contacts. And also in December, one of those unplanned hallway conversations you have at a conference led to contacts being made for a publication on municipal and agricultural water advances that, again, the contacts wouldn't have been made. So we're doing the best we can. I'm really delighted you invited me to give a webinar this morning. Thank you for hosting me. This photo is of all of our speakers at our June conference that was, as I mentioned, held June 18th, 19th. It went off remarkably well. We had a few technological glitches here and there, but nothing that truly interfered with the program. Every speaker showed up and did a great job. And so I'm going to make quite a bit of use of this photo. Again, we can do a lot virtually, but it's not the same as being there in person, getting to know each other in person. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm ready for questions. And just as David pointed out, my CV is readily accessible. Any publication that I can post and make readily available has a link on my CV or is posted on the website. We do webinars, although they're slowed down for the summer. But if anybody's interested in following our weekly or in the summer bi-weekly news of what we're up to, please go and subscribe. And with that, what I'm going to do is, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back on and be ready to talk with you. So I should be back.
Yes, so
Thank you, Sharon.
Sylvie, you would like to?
Just to thank first. Maybe we can let people ask questions.
I have a question. I don't know if you see my hand.
Okay. Do you hear me? Okay, I have a question about, you have spoken about new ways of designing built environments as a new issue. Do you have some examples?
So this is really work in progress, I believe. I want to share with you that besides academic publications, I tend to write columns, more like blogs. And I was writing one where I was listing that list of solutions that I had in one of my slides. And I had one of those aha moments, and that is the water community, the water manager community, the water governance community tends not to think about the way we design our communities. And we in the United States, certainly in the West, where we're still growing, we don't do a very good job of connecting land use planning and water planning. And in fact, some of us are working on a conference on that for the summer of 2021. And so the idea of considering how to make better use of water within buildings, or rooftop gardens. When I was in Singapore, that's something that they're working on quite a lot. The idea of do we, as an area that takes transplants from the Midwestern United States or the Eastern, do we have to keep building our developments with lawns in the front and lots of greenery, because that's what people are used to? And so through our college and colleges of architecture and planning and landscape architecture, I see much more of a connection now on the water energy use of buildings and community design. I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I think that's part of the solution set. So there are examples, but there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. And I could certainly put you in touch with people who work on that in a primary way more than I do.
Okay, thank you. I think Marie-Lise would like to ask a question.
Yes, thank you. You can hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. You conclude your talk by saying that technology is a solution. And I wanted to know if stakeholders consider other ways of doing, such as an adaptation of practices. And I'm thinking about agricultural practices. And do people consider culture something else or adapt their practices? Yeah.
So let me just ask you, do you mean in terms of adaptive practices, different ways of doing the irrigation, different crops within agriculture? Is that what your question? Okay, I just wanted to make sure I understood the question correctly. So the answer is yes, when they're incentivized to do so. And so the incentives come in because they expect less water. The incentives come in if the costs of the water or other inputs change. And it's like a lot of situations where you need pilots and examples, because there's some efforts going on right now, some study efforts involving my university. There's another study effort going on that could signal a significant shift in cropping, the types of crops they grow. But it's very expensive and it's very scary to do that. They might not be able to borrow the money if some of the implications are unknown. So what is really important is for there to be collaborative efforts and efforts that maybe help keep the farmers whole financially if you're asking them to try something that has some risk. And I'll give an example of that. A few years ago, well, it's actually many years ago now, in 2011, I had the opportunity to travel to the Northwestern United States, to the state of Oregon, with some environmentally oriented people and some agriculturally oriented people. And one of the purposes of it was to build relationships, and another was to learn about what they'd done there. And in the case there, what some trusts or foundations were doing were asking the farmers to irrigate their fields less, maybe one less time, and see what the implication is for their forage, for what they would feed the animals in the winter. And they made sure that if they fell short of the productivity, that they would make up for it by buying food for the animals. So, this was something that they could try. It was a little risky, and in certain cases, the results were very good. They found out that the yield of the forage was quite good. One thing to keep in mind in certainly my region is most of the agriculture is irrigated agriculture. Very limited amount can depend on just the rain and the natural precipitation. On some of the tribal nations, they still employ the more traditional practices, but it's highly dependent on irrigation. And so changes on the irrigation technology, that has been occurring. Again, incentivizing that through grant programs and the like is helpful. And then changing cropping patterns is happening and will happen. And there's a very interesting case of that. This is the last part of my answer, so not to talk for too long on one thing, but we could certainly follow up, is the case of Yuma, Arizona. So Yuma is in the southwestern part of the state of Arizona. It's just north of the border with Mexico. And 35 years ago or more, it pretty much, they limited their activities to corn, wheat, alfalfa, hay. But then they transition, and they happen to have a lot of water there because they're right on the Colorado River and they have some senior water rights. But they, over time, transitioned to growing leafy green vegetables, such that that region supplies a large proportion of the leafy green vegetables for the United States between the months of November and March. And they are producing much more value in terms of crops, and using actually less water because of the way those crops are irrigated than they did beforehand. But that was a long-term switch that they were able to do because they have the advantage of being near some transportation networks and also near the border, and depend on Mexican day labor coming over the border to work. So it goes, one of the things that I didn't highlight was you have to understand the individual circumstances and see what might be feasible, but adaptation has occurred and is occurring. And one of the things I sometimes point out to more academic audiences, such as this one, is that we as academicians talk a lot about adapting to climate change, adapting to other things. And many practitioners, be it in agriculture and water management, they're adapting all the time. They just don't label it adaptation. They don't raise their hand and say, look at me, I'm adapting, but they are adapting. And so there is quite a lot of that going on. Could be more, could be more.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have two questions from, sorry, I don't know the name. It's Ifnav, maybe.
Oui, bonjour, mon nom c'est Luzma. Donc, I have two questions. First is, are we developing better ways to address modern wicked problems? The second one is how science can help policymakers to identify first these kind of problems, and second, some potential solutions. Merci.
Oh.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm not sure I heard fully, because I think you broke out on a key word on your first question. So could you please, Crystal, did you get the full first question?
Okay,
sure.
yeah, so she wrote the question on the chat, so I'm reading. Are we developing better ways to address modern wicked problems?
Okay, but with wastewater in particular, right? Or not?
Wastewater?
If not, was your first part related to wastewater?
I guess, Sharon, you can go with wastewater if you are comfortable with this answer.
Okay, so the question of solutions, let me maybe start off responding with solutions themselves can have wicked problems associated with them. It's not like solutions are just solutions without trade-offs. And so I'll give an example, of course, that I think everybody would be familiar with of desalination. We know that desalination has at least two major issues. And one is the energy requirements, which have something to do not only with the cost, but of course also the carbon footprint, depending upon the type of energy that is used to supply the required energy needs. And then of course the brine. If you're talking about seawater desalination, only 50% of the input comes out as clean water, another 50% is concentrated brine, and the disposal of that gives rise to concerns about what it means to the marine life, and is it diluted enough upon discharge. Inland desalination, which is important in many instances and has potential within the state of Arizona, you don't have even the ready access to a body of water for discharge. in most instances. And so what do you do with the brine is important. With wastewater, this may be a little bit off topic, but I'm sure, or I would imagine that many of you have read that people are looking at wastewater inflows to try to look at the markers for COVID-19. And there's some research going on right now to try to identify where there might be pockets or hotbeds of COVID-19. And the technology for tertiary treatment has been improving. The problem with, or one of the problems with wastewater treatment right now and wastewater in general is that there are many unknowns because of things we do not measure. And so one of the challenges there may be a wicked water problem. What do you attempt to regulate and what do you not regulate? And for example, our Environmental Protection Agency currently may not be looking at even studying the regulation of some things that some people think should be studied. And then the big question of the reuse of that treated wastewater. In more water-rich areas, it will typically get discharged into a river and flow downstream to the next community that may treat it and discharge it. Yeah, I see a thumb up saying that is what happens. Or in a drier area, it may be the only water source that sustains the riparian area other than occasional flooding. And so the reuse of the water, and for what purposes? For agriculture, what kinds of crops? For drinking purposes and the like. These are all part of kind of the developing pathways to solutions and the various things that academia and other researchers have to look at when looking at these solutions. And so to the second part of the question is, what can the scientists do? The scientists need to do what they're doing and continue to do that. The scientists, because the scientists, and it includes the social scientists, as an economist, I will just insert that there are some people, when I was trained many years ago, was like, oh, you only deal with positive economics, meaning Pareto optimality, and that's all built on assumptions. And the economists don't have to say much about, or shouldn't say much about what should be, the normative part. But the economists and others have the ability to look at the trade-offs, evaluate the options and opportunities, and provide a complete, or as complete as possible, and fair assessment of them to the decision makers. So the scientists, I think, have an important role to play in that. The idea of transdisciplinary research, and I realize that there are multiple definitions of what is transdisciplinary research. When I think about it, I think about where you're going to the outside and having the practitioners and others help provide input and define your research questions as part of the transdisciplinarity of the research. So developing projects that meet the needs of those with whom you expect to share your research results is very, very important. And the scientists, though, with that ability, I would say, comes some important obligations or responsibilities. And that those would include, and I'm sure you would have other things to add, the recognition of sharing information with practitioners and decision makers requires a different kind of communication than sharing with researchers. And I think both types of communications are very important. Researchers tend to get focused on impact factors a lot, right? The impact factor of a journal. And that's very important for our research getting disseminated and all that. But we also need to think about the impact on policy and helping solve the problems. And often that will require a different type of communication. And another thing, and I believe Sylvie said this at the outset, is bridging more with the stakeholders so that they get involved potentially in your projects early in the process, not only at the end when you're done and you're there to share it, because they will have more buy-in to it, they'll be more interested in it, and they can also help along the way. And we have found that in some of our projects. So again, I think the scientists need to keep doing what they're doing, but maybe just communicate at different phases and stages of it a bit differently. And maybe over time, there'll be even an evolution of the way some of the research questions are defined.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for this very detailed answer. There is another question from David and then Gilles.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sharon, for this very inspiring talk. I have a question about governance, or more specifically levels of governance. And in this case of the huge plumbing systems such as the Colorado, which is what is, according to you, the best level of governance? I remember that Governor Babbitt, the former governor of Arizona, said a few weeks ago that basically the Colorado was a Bureau of Reclamation river, so everything was decided by the Bureau of Reclamation at the national scale. So what do you think, what is the best level of governance? How should we like manage this river at a lower scale, upper scale? How it's fitting with your framework of this wicked water problem?
Yes, that's a great question, David. And I'm sure you recognize there's not a simple answer to that. I should explain for the audience that we have even within the Colorado River Basin different approaches to the governance of the upper basin and lower basin. And so it's so complicated, and it's governed by something that we call the law of the river, quote unquote, the law of the river. And that's not, and I'm saying some of this, David, for being in Arizona and following this for a while, I'm sure you're aware of this, but others may not. It's not a single law. There's not a place where you can go and say, okay, here's the law of the Colorado River. I can read it in this one volume or two volumes, and that's it. It's a collection of federal laws, case law from the courts, practices, treaties, and kind of implementation over time. And even within the Colorado River Basin, the way the water is allocated in the upper basin is by percentages. And I want to spend a few minutes on this because I think it could be worthwhile to show why something that might seem so logical is so difficult to accomplish. In the upper basin, the water is distributed to the 4 states in the upper basin based on percentages. And then there's they don't get to use as much water as generated up there because they're deliver a certain amount over a 10-year period to the lower basin. So think about that's by percentages. In the lower basin, the water is allocated by actual amount of water. And California gets A, Nevada gets B, Arizona gets C. These are like fixed numbers. And it turns out that, and I mentioned this very briefly in the presentation, that the water's over allocated. There's too much water being allocated to the 3 states than the average flows of the river and can support. And so you might think, well, why doesn't the process for allocating in the lower basin just change to one like the upper basin and everybody takes kind of percentage cutback? Well, that would involve a change to the law of the river. And that is a very, very complex undertaking. It would require, in this case, and to your point about the Bureau of Reclamation, it would require federal law to change, and think about getting that kind of change through. It would then give rise probably to lawsuits, and it would take forever to resolve if that were to happen or not. So what, I'm not answering your question directly, and I want to come back to that, but let me mention that the Department of Interior, which is the federal agency that houses the Bureau of Reclamation, is basically considered the master or the operator of the lower basin. And the Bureau of Reclamation implements that for the Department of Interior and is the coordinating agency. And that's why this all gets so complicated, because the Bureau of Reclamation could on its own just issue regulations, but it must go through a consultative process. And I would say that the desire to keep things out of the courts and amicable has given rise to what is a very participatory governance process involving the 7 states, involving Mexico, involving the US government, involving discussion tables. And so there is a shared governance, but in the final analysis, the decisions are made by the US government because it is a shared waterway. If the waterway were only within a given state, the role of the federal government would be much, much less. But because of the shared nature of this waterway, it is a shared governance. And so it is shared governance. Now, one of the things I'll just bring up here that's a governance challenge is the issue of surface water versus groundwater governance and the lack of congruity of the relevant boundaries. A big question that can come up is what is the right way to govern groundwater? And when you have basin authorities that are largely river connected, such as I believe is the case in France, how does that work with groundwater? And what is the right level? Groundwater tends to be very local. And so that's where you'll tend to see the more local approaches. So even in my presentation, I talked about the Colorado River Basin first, that involves all the local players at the bottom up, but with still a top-down potential. But then went into the groundwater situation that's a much more local. So, you know, there's no perfect answer to that, but I think what's important is that you get the people who need to be at the table. It can take a lot of time. It can be a big table, but that's still a better way of doing it than excluding people.
Thank you, Sharon. Another question from Gilles.
Thank you, Sharon, for this interesting talk. While you were talking, I was wondering, when we live our life as a human being, aren't we most of our time finally facing wicked issues that we have to solve as a human being? And so this is something we might rediscover as a community, but probably as a human soul, we are facing that every day, and every day we have to sort out that wicked issues to go this way or that way, and there's no single solution or no good or bad solution. It's just a kind of a trade-off. And that brings me to the next question, which is, it seems to me that basically stakeholders are either moving because of interest or because of being forced, and there's not much room for altruism in this kind of system. And I was wondering, how do you foresee your approach in these very basic, sadly human forces, which is either I gain something or I'm forced to do so, I will comply. And the second question I had, which is more focused for Arizona, a little bit provocative, is in the end, a sustainable issue for Arizona, isn't it, to move these 5 million people city somewhere else?
Okay, so let me first talk about the idea of whether, if I interpret your first question, it was partly dealing, are people intransigent? Are they unwilling to kind of compromise and move position?
People are capable, but stakeholders is not people, is also kind of, I suppose, a kind of a group of people. And when you become a group of pressure, then intransition comes in, and protection is more of an issue.
Yes, and that's really an important point that you're making. And I have to say that I appreciate your even bringing up the question of what's a stakeholder or what's a group, right? Because I will say that in some cases, I often will say everybody's a water stakeholder, right? Everybody drinks water, purchases water, needs water. But in our day-to-day business, many of the water agencies deal with kind of the expert stakeholders, the stakeholders that have the staff and the resources and the need to show up at meetings and to follow things. And so just the definition of a stakeholder, I think, is an important one that we could talk about separately. But to your point about what could get people to, let's say, agree on things, again, part of it comes down to if there's something, and I hate to put it this way, but if there's something forcing them. And that's what we don't want to have happen, right? We want to anticipate the issues and we want to deal with them in a proactive, upfront way. But sometimes people are not, won't agree to some of the changes and to do some things unless there's something looming over them. And David mentioned Bruce Babbitt. Bruce Babbitt was governor of the state of Arizona when our landmark Groundwater Management Act was passed. And Bruce Babbitt was a keynote speaker of that slide I showed. It was his photo in the upper left-hand corner, a little bigger. He was one of 2 keynote speakers at our conference, the other being the commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation. And he proposed something very controversial, or discussed something controversial at the meeting, and that is the movement. And this relates to your second question. The movement of water from the Colorado River, more water from the Colorado River into central Arizona to support the growth that's occurring in central Arizona. And he argued for a process much like the one that occurred that led up to our 1980 Groundwater Management Act. And when I spoke with him in advance of the conference, and I knew that was the basics of what he was going to talk about, but I didn't know the details. I said, back in 1980, there was kind of a hammer over the head of the people. And that was, if you want the funding through Congress to get the Central Arizona project built, subject to repayment, but get the funding fronted by the US Congress, you need to do something about your groundwater regulations, because we're not so excited about building you a new big a surface water infrastructure problem if you're not going to conserve the groundwater and make wise use of it. So Governor Babbitt was able to say, hey, if we want to get this done, we need to really come to terms. They've been working on it for years, but it hadn't happened. And so it happened. And the question is, what's the hammer this time? What's to bring people on this particular issue to the table? And I'm not sure there is something to bring to the table. And I think I just read a news story over the weekend. There are proposals to transfer water from the Colorado River to support the growth in central Arizona. And the people who live on the river, including their legislators, say, we don't think we should do that. You need to live within your means. And so your question about move the cities to where the water is, a lot of people, there's a book that I haven't read, and I know that some people criticize it a lot, that basically argues that Phoenix is an unsustainable city. And the people in Phoenix many of them don't believe that. And there are people, you know, there's a saying that we use in English, water runs uphill to money, that money can fix the problems. And that could be technology or that could be markets. This question of the movability of water, I think, is a key one. And but thus far, I do have to say that because we have in Arizona, this is specific to Arizona, these 100-year assured water supply rules, it's not like we're growing on fake water, but there are some concerns about the legal construct of how we grow. And I personally have advocated for some active conversation about this involving legislators and water professionals and others on this. Because I often point out to people that water professionals, the practitioners, spend long days every day working on these issues, and it's still hard to keep up with everything. And so when you have elected officials who are the decision makers who may not be specialists, it's really important that we work to with them and to educate them. And so back to the last question about what can we as scientists do, you know, I'll broaden it to as academicians, we need to work on educating the people about the situation because it's quite complex.
But the question was more like, do you think the people from Phoenix will live there as long as the Navajo? And that's, you know, we have to take a kind of a long-term thing, is that how long will you be able to process? Of course, we can always bring water from somewhere else, but how long will it be finally sustainable in a way, or economically or viable, so that people can still keep going and growing green grass on their garden and going golfing and on top having agriculture, having agriculture in the area, which is probably not possible.
Yeah, you know, there have been changes in the question earlier about adaptation. I don't think Phoenix is going away. Now, I think if there were a problem in a true problem in obtaining water for growth, it would slow down the growth. I don't think it would force the people to go away. I once, but of course I'm not a predictor, but so don't go to the bank on my prediction here. But agriculture, there has been a lot of adaptation. I mean, there are low water use landscaping ordinances. I didn't mean to suggest that everybody's got green grass. There are people who are taking out their individual swimming pools. I honestly wish and I have to share with you, back in 2008, David mentioned that, or I think David mentioned, I gave a lecture that was sponsored by Eau de Paris. It was at their learning center in Paris. And I was giving a presentation about our shortage of water and our challenges. And I realized as I was speaking that we have so much potential to conserve and use less to do what we're already doing. And in fact, we have been using less. Per capita community water use has gone down significantly in most Western cities because they are building communities differently. Although we are so hot here and a lot of people still want to have their individual swimming pools, and fully 40 to 60% of residential water use is outdoor water use. It's for shade trees, which are good. They cut down on air conditioning costs and the like. But, you know, community pools rather than individual swimming pools. Some communities don't allow grass in the front, but allow grass in the back because people need to have their areas. Actually, artificial turf is becoming much, much more popular for people to have. And people are adapting in their individual water use. And also, agriculture is being replaced by housing. Now, that's got an upside and a downside. The upside might be when it comes to overall water use, I'm not going to talk about, individual people. It's expected that on an acre or measure of land, you use less water for some houses than you would for agriculture. The downside, and that's not always true, but largely believed to be true. The downside is that for an area like Phoenix, if all the agriculture goes away, you lose some of your kind of green space, your open space, and you also maybe lose some of the buffer you might have when there's an acute need to cut back. But agricultural water use has gone down tremendously in the Phoenix area. The Salt River Project, which I haven't mentioned at all, which is a within Arizona project that was built by the Bureau of Reclamation, the first project ever in the early 1900s. It takes water from river systems within the state for delivery in Arizona. When it went online, fully over 90% of the water use in that area was for agriculture. Now well over 90% is not for agriculture. So there's been change. But I could, and I once did this, you could talk about very bad cases, worst case. And what I think that would mean is a shrinkage, maybe, a change in people's wealth and property values. But I don't think the cities will go away. But they could change what they look like. I mean, I think that could happen.
Thank you, Sharon. A very last question by Sylvie.
Yes, I wanted to go back to methodology and strategies, and when you face the complexity with interconnected problems, conflictual problems, you find solutions or sets of trade-off solutions or sets of actions. And how do you manage the way to evaluate over the time the strategy so that to be sure that you go in the correct way? I don't know if my question is clear, but
yes, no,
it's
it is
sort
clear.
of retroaction, in order to retroact on the strategy you set. You stated.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily, and others may have different answers to your question based on their experiences and observations. It's not necessarily a linear or smooth path to adopting the solutions. It could be uneven. It could be that some things that were not thought to be feasible are then discovered to be feasible. So I don't think you ever stop working, but I'll give you one example in a binational setting that relates to something I did talk about a little bit, and that is, for a very long time, for many, many years now, there has been discussion of the United States partnering with Mexico on desalination, either on the Pacific Ocean side of Mexico or in the Sea of Cortez, which is what the Colorado River empties into, if the water actually gets there. And that's been talked about for many years. It's of particular interest to Arizona because if you could develop a desalination effort whereby United States entities invested in it, and maybe what they get for their investment is to take some of the water that by treaty goes to Mexico and instead deliver it within the United States. So you do an exchange or a swap. That could potentially augment Arizona's water supplies, because there's a desire to see how could we augment it. But that's very complex. I mean, it involves binational cooperation. And so while it's been talked about, and while it's had some fits and starts, through these basically interpretations of the 1944 treaty between the US and Mexico, these things we call minutes. They're called a minute. They're an interpretation. The one that was approved a few years ago called for binational study of desalination opportunities. And it's some of those people involved in the binational study that came with me to Tel Aviv. They've been working together. I'm not a primary participant in that study. But the study has a binational team. It has binational practitioners. It has binational agencies that would be the ones to enter into an agreement if there ever was one. And they're working very carefully together. And in fact, even the request for proposal for the study team happened to come through the Central Arizona Project, whose board I'm on. And it was, I keep it on my iPad. It was the most beautiful proposal I've ever seen because it was fully bilingual. It had beautiful photos through it. And it really gave a sense of understanding the need for this to be a truly equal kind of study. Whether in the end they conclude that desalination in a binational approach is feasible in the Sea of Cortez, we'll see. But in the process, they worked on the words they used, the approach they used, they make sure, you know, it's truly equal looking at it, and they'll give a careful look. And even if it doesn't come now in the immediate, they could be laying that foundation for the future or for what may go on in the Pacific. So this is a very hard question of, you know, kind of what pathway do you follow on the pathway to solutions? But if you don't have the right processes set up, it's very difficult to even get on the road, let's say. So I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but it's the best one I can do at this point.
Very interesting, very fruitful. It's time to leave now. We have been really honored you give this presentation. It was the first webinar of the Doctoral School of Watershed Science in Lyon. And thank you also to David to have done the connection and give us the opportunity for this great discussion. So this is truly a first experience, really successful. So I think it's a coffee break for you and a deep.
Yes, and thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this and start a dialogue, and hopefully we'll get to continue it.
Okay.
Definitely, we need dinner. We have to eat together. So we wait for you in Lyon next time.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. To something or?
No, but thank you, Sharon, again. Thank you to Lyon to invite Sharon and to organize the seminar. Thank you very much.
And could I just ask, I did a list of the attendees' names and maybe email addresses, and I invite anybody who'd like to contact me individually to feel free to do so.
Yeah, okay, no problem.
Thank you.
We can do that. Thank you very much again.
Bye.
Bye-bye, Sharon. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.